Hello guys and welcome to my new video, and today it's going to be a massive day because there is some huge tuning changes for healers, some big buffs, big nerfs. We're going to be talking about all of the changes, how it might impact the meta, what does it mean, is it good or bad. Let's go and get started. Let's go and get started with Preservation of Evoker and the changes here. They're nerfing your season 1 tier set bonus because they feel it's too powerful and they probably don't want people to stick with that bonus for too long, which makes sense. Healing of all spells and abilities increased by 5%, which is another nice change, but keep in mind this does not impact all of your abilities because Preservation of Evoker has certain abilities that are going to scale based on incoming damage, things like Rewind and Golden Hour. Spirit Bloom healing is increased by 20%, nice. Energizing Flame refunds 80% of the mana cost of Living Flame when used to attack an enemy target, used to be 50. There was somewhat of a similar change happening to Holy Paladin again a little while back in terms of using your holy shocks offensively and they're not costing as much mana. This is nice change because if you feel like there's nothing happening and you want to contribute damage, you feel like you can do that without losing too much mana, and this is the way that it should be. Disintegrate damage is increased by 25% for preservation, and living flame damage is also increased by 25% for preservation. So DPS buffs, healing buffs, overall I think this is pretty nice and something that Preservation of Evoker needed. Do I feel people are going to be swapping from other healers and playing Preservation of Evoker all of a sudden because of these changes? Not really. I think the 5 remaining Preservation of Evokers that play in this game, they're going to be really happy about this, but I still feel like this healer requires a lot of effort, and I think new players are kind of scared about that. If you're a Preservation Evoker, you're happy about this. I think they addressed some of the issues that Evoker has. And now let's talk about Mistweaver Monk, and there's going to be some substantial nerfs here, but we'll talk about it. It's not the end of the world. At the end of the day, I think Blizzard achieved exactly what they mentioned in developer's note. We're decreasing Mistweaver's overall damage while leaving their healing relatively unchanged. I think they basically achieved this, and a lot of people were expecting this. All damage decreased by 25%. Now, this is something that has been on the mind since the Race to World First because a lot of people were stacking multiple Mistweaver Monks, and Mistweaver Monk, or one of the big advantages of having monks, was the fact that they could do a lot of healing and they could provide an insane amount of damage. As an example, this is healer damage contribution in the new raid in terms of mythic, in terms of 75 percentile, and you can see Mistweaver Monk was eating really good, and it's one of the reasons why it was stacked in terms of Race to World First. Personally, I would have liked to see bigger DPS increases to other healers out here because I do think that healer DPS outside of certain cases has been kind of falling off in the last couple of expansions, but that's my 2 cents. I really would like to know your opinion. A 25% DPS nerf to Mistweaver Monk is not going to be the end of the world. If you look at the, again, we're looking at the raid damage contribution from healers. If you look at the mythic plus damage contribution from healers, Mistweaver Monks, again, they're doing an insane amount of damage. So the nerf is not going to be the end of the world, but at the end of the day, you still have to remember Monk is one of those type of healers that's going to live and die based on its output. Some of the utility that it provides doesn't really compare to some other healers. So let's look at the rest of the changes. So your damage has been nerfed, but Blizzard needs to account for the fact that Mistweaver Monk can rely on healing through damage depending on the build and things like that. So Jadefire Teaching now increases Ancient Teachings transfer amount by 215% instead of 160. So these changes right here mean that your damage is going to be lower, but your healing is going to have a minuscule overall net nerf depending on how you take advantage of these things here. So it's not really all that noticeable in terms of HPS loss depending on the builds that you're running and things like that, but the damage nerf is going to be felt. Outside of that, spinning cranking damage has been increased by 15%. Awakened Jadefire now transfers 120% of damage done, used to be 110%. And this is basically the spinning crane kick portion of Awakened Jadefire. So they want spinning crane kick to be more usable. We'll have to see at how many enemies you're gonna start pressing this button. Again, it's going to depend on the hero build you're running also. So in terms of overall changes, Blizzard achieved exactly what they wanted. We're decreasing Mistweaver's overall damage while leaving their healing relatively unchanged. Now let's go to Holy Paladin, and I think a lot of Holy Paladins are going to be extremely happy with the changes right here. Arguably some of the biggest healer increases right now, and if you stuck with Holy Paladin, you should be extremely happy right now because all healing is increased by 3%. Again, that's all right. Word of Glory and Eternal Flame healing is increased by additional 20%. More buffs to spenders. This is something that Blizzard has been kind of messing around for a long time. Light of Dawn healing is increased by 20%. Holy Prism AoE healing and damage increased by additional 30%. Holy Prism single target healing and damage increased by additional 50%. They're trying to make Holy Prism more impactful. And again, Holy Prism is an extremely, or the most popular talent build when it comes to Mythic Plus and raiding. Shield of Righteous damage increased by 30%. There is DPS and HPS increases, and if you're looking at some of the numbers, this is almost double-digit HPS increases depending on the content that you're doing, which is absolutely well-deserved and something that people are going to be really happy. If you look at some of the random logs in Mythic Plus in terms of Holy Paladin damage contribution, this is a plus 15 Cinder Brew meter. If you look at Shield of Righteous, it ends up making up a decent portion of your overall damage. That is getting buffed on top of some sizable HPS buffs. I think a lot of Holy Paladins are going to be extremely happy with the changes that they see here. Do I think Holy Paladin is going to become S tier plus healer in all forms of content? I don't think so. But if you're playing Holy Paladin right now, you're extremely happy, and you have to keep an ear to the ground in terms of what is going to happen in the future, because it is going to be a lot easier to play Holy Paladin right now. Now let's talk about Holy Priest right now. And honestly, this section right here, I'm most unsure about, because a lot of other healers received some flat healing increases, while Holy Priest received some buffs to some of the underperforming talents and underperforming hero builds. So we might see some changes in the future, but I'd love to know your opinion about how you feel about these changes so far. At the end of the day, these are buffs to Holy Priest. So you are going to be doing more healing and more damage, but I'm just not sure about the overall number. Go and get started. Prayer of Healing. Healing is increased by 25%. Now, I'm still not sold on Prayer of Healing, even with this increase. But I know there's going to be people who are going to try out Prayer of Healing for themselves, see if it works for their kind of playstyle. I still don't feel really all that exciting about Prayer of Healing, and I'd really love to know your opinion about this. Outside of that, we saw Prayer Mending Healing is increased by 20%, Renew Healing is increased by 60%, Lightwell Healing is increased by 30%, Divine Image Healing and damage increased by 20%, Holy Fire damage increased by 20%, Renewed Faith now increases the healing done to allies with Renew. Again, you're seeing a lot of renews here. By 10% instead of 6%, renews from Empowered Renew now heals for 120% more than a normal Renew. Used to be 60%. This is why I feel like I'm unsure about a lot of these changes here, because there's a lot of buffs to underutilized talents. There's a lot of incentive or possible incentive to some other builds emerging. This is why I really want to know your opinion. I think a lot of people are going to be cooking up different things. Maybe nothing is going to change in terms of builds. I'm not sure, but I think Blizzard trying to buff some of the, again, outside choices is actually really interesting. And outside of that, there is some buffs to Oracle, and this makes absolute sense, because for most of the Holy Priests running Mythic Plus and Raid, the most popular hero build is going to be Archon. And I think the fact that Blizzard is trying to buff the underperforming hero builds makes sense. I wish they would have done that for few other healers, and I think they missed out on few other healers because there is a big disparity between hero builds. But for Oracle, Preemptive Care now increases the duration of Renew by 40% instead of 25%. Preventative Measures now increases the healing of Prayer Mending by 40%, and Preventative Measures now also increases the damage of Smite and Holy Fire and Holy Nova by 40% instead of 25%. So overall, Blizzard is making quite a few changes to Holy Priest. I'm not sold on Prayer of Healing just yet, but I would love to know your opinion. Overall, this is a buff to Holy Priest. Let me know how you feel about this. And now let's talk about Discipline Priests, and these are going to be nerfs to disc, and they're going to be depending on the content you're doing, or the extent of these nerfs is going to be depending on multiple different factors. So Lenience now causes Atonement to reduce damage taken by 2% instead of 3%. Atonement now causes spell damage to heal all targets affected by Atonement for 32% of damage done instead of 35%. So this is, right now, if you're reading this, 8.5% nerf to your Atonement. Again, Atonement does not make up of 100% of your healing, so this is not going to be an 8.5% nerf to your overall healing as a discipline. Atonement contribution to your healing is going to depend on the content you're doing and also the hero build that you're running. So let's look at the example of some of the logs. So let's look at some random logs. This is a raid log for Mythic Rick Reaver for Discipline Priest that's running Oracle, and you can see here Atonement account of 40% of the overall healing. This is a random log. In Mythic Plus, I think this is a plus 14 Floodgate for a Discipline Priest who was running Void Weaver, and their Atonement was accounting for 64% of the overall healing. So the nerf is going to be dependent on the content you're running and things like that. So I don't think this is the end of the world for Discipline Priest. I still think this was in a very good spot. We're going to be looking at Mythic Plus, we're going to be looking at Raid, HVS and things like that, and we'll talk about what it means in those sections. But Discipline is not dead. It's still a very strong healer. And now let's talk about Restoration Shaman, and this is going to be an extremely weird one because there is a substantial bug with Totemic Resto Shaman in the tier set that I'm assuming a lot of the Mythic raiding Resto Shamans knew and they were abusing it, and this means that by fixing this, you will see a HPS drop, and there might be Resto Shamans who had no idea about this. They didn't have the tier set, but overall the charts will possibly change. We'll cover that in the next section, but let's talk about the bug itself. So this is my Restoration Shaman, and I literally just got the tier set right now. So the tier set is when you cast Surging Totem, 2 allies in the radius have insurance applied to them, which is all great. You press your Surging Totem, you can see here my insurance is counting down. You can see that my whole grid 2 changes to green to showcase that that person has insurance. But the way that the tier set registers, when you use Totemic Projection, the game thinks that you cast that Surging Totem again. So if I cast my Totemic Projection to move it on myself, it procs insurance. So I was ready to make a weak order that tells me when Totemic Projection is available. The whole, Totemic Projection was going to become part of your rotation as a Totemic Resto Shaman. This bug absolutely needed to be fixed because, first of all, why would you play Farseer when you can play Totemic Resto Shaman, abuse this bug, and have an insane amount of insurance healing? So I'm happy they fixed this bug, but the other changes did not really, how do I say, it needed more of a compensation. And this is what I mean by the compensation. Under mine 2-piece set bonus, insurance healing is increased by 30%. You might look at that and you're like, okay, they fixed the bug and they tried to compensate for it. The fact is, if you're a Resto Shaman, and again, I'm assuming we'll look at logs, we'll look at rating logs and all those things. If you're a Resto Shaman who knew about this bug and abused this bug, this compensation buff is not close to enough. So I feel that there is going to be a dip in terms of Resto Shaman healing. I actually kind of feel like Blizzard should have added like an overall HPS increase to Resto Shaman to account for fixing of this bug. So it looks like, depending if you knew about this issue or not, it looks like a pretty decent nerf to Resto Shamans, which makes no sense. So let's look at what it means for raiding in terms of HPS. Again, HPS doesn't always mean that the healer is the best and all those things, a big disclaimer, but this is mythic rating, this is 75 percentile, this is what the HPS charts look like right now, and you can see the Spin Priest is climbing. So what is going to happen with the nerfs, with the next reset and all those things? This Spin Priest HPS is going to dip because we talked about the Atonement nerf. We talked about the fact that Atonement nerf is going to impact this Spin Priest in different ways depending on the content you're doing. So there is going to be a bit of a healing nerf to this Spin Priest. Resto Druid received 0 changes, which honestly is probably the best outcome for Resto Druid overall, because I actually genuinely think it's going to climb because other healers or some of the top end healers receive nerfs. In terms of Mistweaver Monk and HPS, there's going to be a minuscule change in terms of HPS, and that is going to be somewhat dependent on the build that you're running. So the charts for HPS should not change all that much for Mistweaver Monk. In terms of DPS, there is going to be a DPS nerf that is going to be felt, but Monk is so far ahead in terms of the DPS contribution that a lot of people were still asking for bigger nerfs in terms of damage that the Mistweaver can do. Again, I talked about the fact that I wanted other healers to get a DPS buff instead, but I don't want to harp on about this. In terms of Restoration Shaman, this is the section that I was relatively unhappy about. So we talked about the issue, the bug. I'm assuming that a lot of Resto Shamans here have the tier set bonus. A lot of Resto Shamans were probably abusing the bug. That bug got fixed. The compensation buff is not nearly enough. So I'm assuming Resto Shaman is going to dip. So that is something to be expected depending on how many people were abusing the bug. Preservation Evoker received buffs, something that a lot of Preservation Evokers were expecting. Again, at the end of the day, Preservation HPS is going to climb, Preservation DPS is also going to increase. A lot of people are happy about this. I don't expect players to flock to Preservation because I genuinely believe it is a difficult healer to take the full advantage of the toolkit, but that is more of a personal opinion. And in terms of Holy Priest, when it comes to raiding, you can make some estimates. For example, buff to Lightwell is probably going to make it a far more appealing choice when it comes to raid content. A lot of early estimates are putting Holy Priest changes at around that 6% HPS mark, which is honestly not that bad. And there might not be that much of significant gameplay changes, but we need to wait and see. And Holy Paladin is arguably receiving some of the biggest HPS increases when it comes to raiding, and it's kind of funny because it feels like Blizzard is looking at this chart exactly because, for example, Holy Paladin is getting around 8% buff when it comes to raiding, Holy Priest is getting around 6% buff, and Preservation Evoker is also getting around 6-5% buff. And it feels like Blizzard is trying to get the HPS charts aligned. I think if you're a Holy Paladin who's sticking with this spec, you're extremely happy. And I think if you're a Holy Paladin who kind of re-rolled, you might actually be looking back about playing Holy Paladin. At the end of the day, playing the spec that you enjoy the most is the best value for your subscription. So sizable buffs to Holy Paladin, buffs to Holy Priest, buffs to Preservation Evoker, probably nerfs to Restoration Shaman, Mistweaver staying somewhat similar, Resto Druid staying the same, Discipline Priest is falling a little bit. I think there's going to be a lot better HPS kind of balance right now, but at the end of the day, HPS is not always the determining factor of what makes the healer the best. Play the healer that you enjoy the most. And now let's talk about Mythic Plus and meta and all those things. This is real play information. This is looking at spec diversity in the top 2000 Mythic Plus keys. This is for the first 3 weeks, and you can see this Discipline Priest has been doing pretty well in terms of taking up a large portion of that pie in terms of spec diversity, representation, all those things. And Discipline Priest is receiving a nerf. Now we talked about that the nerf is most likely going to impact you more in Mythic Plus than rating, depending on multiple different factors, but the HPS of Discipline Priest is going to fall. You still provide a lot of nice things for those top end keys, so I still think Discipline Priest is going to do well. If you look at Mistweaver Monk, we'll talk about the fact that Mistweaver Monk damage is going to be lower. I still think you're going to be a very strong DPS healer. Again, we talked about this multiple times throughout the video. A lot of people wanted bigger nerfs to Mistweaver damage, but you have to remember Mistweaver is one of those healers that lives and dies based on its output, because a lot of the utility that you might provide doesn't compare to a lot of healers. Mistweaver or Monk raid buff in terms of Mystic Touch is not all that fantastic. Resto Shaman, again, if you're a Shaman who abused the bug, you'll definitely notice a HPS loss. And in terms of Restoration Druid, Resto Druid received no changes, and I think that's actually for the best, because a lot of these top end healers receive nerfs, and I think Resto Druid is actually gonna climb because of that. I mentioned this in my previous videos that I think it is an absolute sleeper healer. I think it can meet HPS checks relatively easily. I think if you're a good Resto Druid, you can have a really good time. Now, in terms of min-maxing your damage, it requires a lot of skill and effort and things like that. But for example, if your group needs Mark of the Wild, I genuinely think Resto Druid is a really excellent pick. Keep in mind, Balanced Druid is looking really strong right now, so there might be some issues in terms of min-maxing raid buffs and that 5-man comp and things like that. But at the end of the day, if you're looking to meet any healing checks out there, I think Resto Druid is potentially one of the best healers out there. But my early prediction for Restoration Druid is that there's going to be a lot more players looking at the possibility of playing Restoration Druid. There's going to be an increase in numbers, at least I expect an increase in numbers. And if you can really optimize this spec, you're going to reap the benefits. I think there's going to be a lot of happy Restoration Druids. And then the rest of the healers in terms of Preservation Evoker, Holy Paladin, and Holy Priest, they all received buffs across the board. Again, for Preservation Evoker, I still don't think people are going to jump on that Preservation Evoker bandwagon, because I mentioned this throughout the video. I think there is a lot of effort that you need to do in order to min-max this healer, and for a lot of players out there, they do gravitate towards more chill healers, even in that really high-end content. So I don't expect Preservation Evoker to climb too much, but if you're a Preservation Evoker who's playing Mythic Plus right now, you will feel the changes. You're basically going to do more healing and more damage, which is pretty good. Now, in terms of Holy Paladin, again, this spec received some substantial buffs in terms of HPS. There's been buffs to damage and things like that, and I don't think Holy Paladin is going to become an S tier plus healer all of a sudden, but I do think there's going to be players coming back to Holy Paladin, because it is historically a very popular healing spec that a lot of people kind of re-rolled because it just wasn't doing really well at the start, and they're just looking for any excuse to come back. So I think Holy Paladin is going to climb. I'm not sure if it's going to be the top of the top, but I think it is going to have a bigger player base, and I think it's better. We'll have to keep an ear to the ground in terms of seeing how it's going to evolve, but some really nice changes for Holy Paladin. Lastly, for Holy Priest, we did talk about what these changes might mean when it comes to raiding. Make sure to check out the raiding section for that. But for Mythic Plus, I'm not quite sure just yet. We'll have to see if there's going to be experimentation going on and things like that. At the end of the day, these are buffs to your DPS and healing. Let me know how you feel if you are a Holy Priest die-hard main. So overall, you still have to look how each healer is going to complement that 5-man meta comp in terms of optimizing raid buffs. How does each healer complement other specs and things like that? The meta is still somewhat evolving, and these are some substantial changes because your top end healers receive nerfs and the underperforming healers receive buffs, maybe with the exception of Restoration Shaman, because we talked about how the bug fix is going to impact their performance. Maybe Blizzard didn't foresee how big that bug fix is going to be. I would like Blizzard to kind of talk or address Farseer a little bit more, maybe the healing rain interactions and things like that. Play the healer that you enjoy the most, because like I said, it is the best value for your subscription. Let me know which healer you think received some of the best changes. If you like this content, like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and I'll see you in my next video.